now he's like, no, fear, insecurity, inferiority, intimidation, all of this stuff rises up. So he takes control. He said, I'm willing to die for you. And even at a denial stage, he turns around and he says, you know what? I'm not with him at all. Don't know him at all. Jesus who? Jesus who? A little later, someone else saw him and said, you're one of them. He says, man, I'm not. No way. Categorically, absolutely wrong. And the gap widens and the distance grows, and Satan starting to get into that place where he's beating and breaking him down. Peter, and then a third time, about an hour later, another asserted, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter says, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And just as he was speaking, cock-a-doodle-doo. And at that very moment, Jesus Christ walks out through the door. And it says, and the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Eye to eye. Face to face. Peter at a distance. Denial 1, denial 2, denial 3. Failure, failure, failure. Shame, shame, shame. Looks into the eyes of liquid agape love. He never challenged Jesus at all. He prophesied it. He'd already seen it happening. And in that place could still love him despite the failure. And it says, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord, before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Now I know with this Singaporean straight face, none of you will admit to that, but most of you have done that. Known you have failed spectacularly in thought, word or deed, and gone away and wept bitterly. That's shame. I failed again. For the umpteenth time, Lord, egg on my face. I have a certificate that says I'm a failure that I wrote to myself. Shame. And then it says in verse 63, and the men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. You know, at that point he's under prison guard. There is no way back for Peter. No way. He couldn't get visitors' rights at the local jail. He wasn't a family member. There was no way. Jesus was gone. And he's left in this place of brokenness and shame, and there's no way back. Turn over to John chapter 20. It has a happy ending, by the way. You get to this position where the crucifixion takes place. He's gone through Pilate. They've decided to save Barabbas, and they've crucified Jesus, and he's taken up the Via Dolorosa carrying the cross. Simon of Cyrene comes in and carries the cross. And I taught on the whole of that during the week of the blood of the Son of God being carried, but covering Simon's face as he carries the cross where Jesus did, helping the Son of God up. And you see that later in Timothy, because he remembered my son, I remembered his. And Rufus and his brother, chosen of the Lord, and Simon's mother was as a mother to Paul. Amazing encounter of everything that happened when they met Jesus. But they're taking Jesus up, they nail him to the cross, and the only disciple that's willing to be identified with him is John, the disciple who boasted in God's love for him, not his love for God like Peter. Peter's nowhere to be seen. Shame has now created such a chasm within that relationship, and there's no way back for Peter. No way at all. And you go through that process in John 20, 28 through to 37, and he gives up his spirit. You know, the only way Satan could take out the Son of God was if Jesus gave up his life. He says earlier, he says, Satan is coming to sift me, but he has nothing in me. That means Satan had no authority, no power to deal with anything and even take Jesus' life. You know, that's the place we can come to. That's a place. He had stuff in Peter, and that sifting that went on, that breaking down that went on, had an effect. Why? Because Satan had areas in Peter's life that God wanted to redeem and wanted to use. And Jesus says, "It is finished," and he gives up his spirit back to the Father, and there's no way back for Peter. He's missed his chance. And when the death, and I've seen it, I've had to minister to somebody recently whose father died, was actually murdered on his way back home from a church prayer meeting. He was murdered at a bus stop in New Zealand, and his daughter raced back, but by the time she got back to New Zealand, he was dead. There was no way that they could talk. There was no way she could express her love. There was no way they could have one final conversation. She got there just in time for the funeral. I've got the article on him. I've also got her testimony of how God's healed her, like in the last 2 months. Just the deep trauma and deep pain that she was carrying. But there was no way back for Peter. And he's buried, in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And you get this whole thing. In Mark 15 verse 1, it talks about this issue. He's died, he's been buried, Friday nights happened, Saturdays happened, and it says early on Sunday morning. I've been teaching the school this all the way through. Every time you see early in the morning in Scripture, it is marked a transition point in heaven's timeline. Every way you look at it, there's been a transition point happen. And he's dead and he's buried, and it says, and in fact in one translation it says very early in the morning. And I was telling the guys, I've done the research on this. Sunset in Jerusalem around the time of Passover is around 5:25 p.m. Jesus was dead by 5:25 p.m. Early in the morning on the first day of the week. It's very clear. The first day of the week is Sunday. On the first day of the week, very early, I think one of the passages it talks about, I think it's Mark, it says very early in the morning, whilst it was still dark, Mary goes to the tomb. Sunrise is 5:20 a.m. 36 hours later, she's on her way to the tomb. In total and utter faith that he's dead. If she wasn't in that place, she wouldn't be carrying spices to anoint the body. She's absolutely 100% certain and convinced he's dead. And it says there that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she comes running back to Simon Peter and the other disciple, which is John, the one that Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and I don't know where they put him." And it says, so Peter and John start for the tomb. Both were running. But the other disciple, John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Love will always outrun shame. And Peter is desperate for this restoration to take place, just to say, "I'm sorry, Lord." And he's running for the tomb, but love outruns shame. To reach that point, he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but John did not go in. Simon, who was behind him, arrived, and in his desperation, he goes straight in. He's not hanging around at the doorway. I'm in there. I want